Thank you very much, Nathan, for that long and rather embarrassing, I'm afraid to say, introduction. Embarrassing because the last thing I want before I pop up and show you the work that I've been doing for the last several years is for you to be told that it's not frivolous, because I assure you that some of it is. But I hope that it's frivolous in the best possible way. But I want to thank Nathan and the CCA for this opportunity to speak with you tonight. I'm excited to get through the presentation part of this so that we can get to the conversation part, because that, after all, is actually the entire point of the work that I do. But the title this evening, well, one last disclaimer, I guess, before we get underway, is that none of the venerable organizations that Nathan mentioned are responsible for what I have to say to you this evening. I should say that many of the ideas that are presented here partly belong to them, in the sense that they have been developed through and with the involvement of some really brilliant like-minded people, also designers who we've worked with over the last several years. But to accept the blame and distribute the credit seems like the chivalrous and true thing to do in this situation. So just to get that out there first. I also want to acknowledge right up front that there is a certain irony in the sort of performative irony, really, in the talk I'm about to give, because in a way, it's about the limits of talk. In a way, it's about the limits of words and the need to find other ways to communicate and to explore possibilities that go beyond the verbal. So I always think it's better to acknowledge the ironies up front. It doesn't completely dissipate them, but hopefully you can forgive me that. And the last sort of word of disclaimer, I guess, is that what you're about to see tonight is largely based on work that I have been involved in. And there's plenty of excellent other work which is similar and far better in some respects, but that I'm less familiar with because I wasn't involved in it. So I'd be happy to point you to some of that, but what I've decided to do for this evening's talk is to stick with what I know best and work from there. So the talk for tonight I've titled The Unthinkable and the Unimaginable. The unthinkable and, excuse me, sorry, this is the first time I've tried this new presentation tool, and it can be a little bit disorienting. Okay, and we're back on track here. The title for this evening's talk is The Unthinkable and the Unimaginable: Why Futures and Design Are Getting Married. And the seed for this title, The Unthinkable and the Unimaginable, comes from a talk given by Bruce Sterling, a name that I'm sure you all know well. It's a talk he gave, it was in a talk that he gave 3 years ago, not here, although he did actually, if you're not aware of it, give an excellent talk here at the CCA in this same lecture series in 2006. But it was another talk that he gave at South by Southwest that year, where he said the following: we're on a kind of we're on a kind of slider bar between the unthinkable and the unimaginable right now, between the grim meat hook future and the bright green future. And there are ways out of this situation. There are actual ways to move the slider from one side to the other, except we haven't invented the words for them yet. We've got smoke building in the crowded theater, but the exit sign is just a mysterious tangle of glowing red letters. So I wanted to begin with this idea of the unthinkable and the unimaginable as two sort of sets of scenarios that we think with. The term unthinkable was first brought to public prominence, I think, by Herman Kahn during the Cold War, when he wrote a book called Thinking the Unthinkable, which was about nuclear scenarios, about end-of-the-world destruction, atomic brighter than 1,000 suns type scenarios. And so unthinkable really is a euphemism or a stand-in for dystopias, for the worst that we can barely bring ourselves to imagine. And then at the other end, we have this idea of the unimaginable. Unimaginable as in unimaginably good, unimaginably sort of utopian. So it's this figure of dystopian futures and utopian ones that, by referencing this, I don't mean any criticism of Bruce, whose work is fantastic. But even in this sort of novel renaming of sets of scenarios, unthinkable and unimaginable, we're coming back to a very old, long-standing typology, if you like, for understanding the future. There's good ones and there's bad ones. And perhaps there's something in between, but they're much harder to think about because they're not as extreme. And I want to just begin by trying to make a little bit of sense for you of that title, which is the unthinkable and the unimaginable. Those extremes are the reason why futures and design need to get married, and why they are, in fact, getting married, not next week, but right now. It's happening as we speak. It's just marriages take a lot longer when it comes to fields of practice and disciplines than with people. So futures and design are getting married. And I want to begin this discussion with a little sort of theoretical interlude. And I think that's important because a lot of people come to futures or futures studies, futurism if you prefer, but I usually use the term futures, with a question about how the hell can you even talk about understanding, how can you talk about studying futures? They don't exist. And I'm going to be the first one to agree with you. They don't exist. The future does not exist. And to give you a sense of the tradition that I'm coming from within futures, which is a very broad church indeed, Jim Dator, D-A-T-O-R, who set up the University of Hawaii's Alternative Futures program nearly 40 years ago, has several laws of the future. The first one is you cannot predict the future because the future does not exist. The second one is any useful statement about the futures should appear to be ridiculous. So I'm not going to explain those right now, but I'm going to just plant them as seeds in your mind, and perhaps they'll sort of make a little bit more sense as we go along. But I do want to acknowledge up front that the tradition of futures thinking in which this work belongs concedes right at the beginning that the future is not a place you can go to. It is not a place you can get facts from. It exists entirely in our mind as a set of ideas, vastly varying, differing from person to person, and ubiquitous. Everyone has ideas about the future. It's sort of an outgrowth of the fact that we are conscious beings. So to continue on this theoretical interlude, what is this mysterious picture I have up here? Well, it's what we might call a cone of possibility. It's almost a cliche, actually, in futures thinking, that if you begin from the present, then branching out from it, that dotted line along the bottom there is the present, and branching out from that moment are various alternative possibilities. And the reason they branch out is, give it a moment's thought, it's obvious. Well, if you do something, then that sort of takes you off in this direction rather than that one, then something else happens and it branches from there. So it's sort of a branching universes idea, but can be reduced, to the limitations of two-dimensional schemata to this sort of diagram. And if we zoom out from that a little bit, we can see a way that futurists quite frequently make sense of this futurescape, of this variety of possible worlds that we could find ourselves living in 5, 10, 50, 100, however many years into the future. So you can see there on the right-hand side, the cone of possibilities, which contains possibility space, represents the span of all possible futures. And you might well ask, and it would be reasonable to do so, I think I might have at one point, what's outside the cone? And the answer is nothing, because this is a model. Okay, so every possible future, whether you've thought about it or not, is inside that cone somewhere. Okay, and then a subset, a smaller group, a smaller set of narratives, ideas, and images of the future are the plausible ones. Now, I don't always use plausible. Some futurists do, some don't, because plausible and possible are very difficult to tell apart. It all depends on your point of view. That is to say, you're not going to entertain as possible futures that you don't consider plausible, by and large. So, you may or may not use that, but the classic kind of trifecta of classes of futures, which comes from Roy Amara, one of the founders of Institute for the Future, is possible, probable, and preferable. And this diagram gives you a little bit of an idea of how they relate. And the general goal of futures thinking, I think it's fair to say, is to merge the preferable with the probable. But rather than talking about probable futures, which is what a lot of people think about when they hear future studies, they think that the idea is to zero in on the thing that is most likely to happen. Some people do that, and they make a very good living at it, and good luck to them. But that is not what this lecture is about tonight. It's about the possible. It's about the edges of the cone and how we can explore all that space when, as I've just said a few minutes ago, it contains everything that all of us have ever thought about the future. And it's incredibly sort of confusing and diverse and I mean, really hyperdimensional space. So how the hell do you explore hyperdimensional possibility space? That's what I'm about to tell you. Well, we divide it up into 4 chunks. Now, this is a different set of 4 chunks from those you may have heard of before, say, the Global Business Network, Prominent Futures Consultancy. There are ways of dividing up possibility space into for strategic planning purposes, which are very useful and which focus on particular issues. But what I'm about to describe to you is a different way of doing it that is intended to illuminate the outer reaches of possibility space, of that cone that we talked about, the 4 corners of possibility space, if you like. I realize I'm mixing my geometrical metaphors there because a cone doesn't actually have 4 corners, but just bear with me. So the first one is continued growth, or continuation. And when you consider continuation, it's not difficult to, or continue, I prefer to use these actually as verbs. So if current trends, particularly upward trends in terms of expanding consumption, production, population, economic and demographic drivers in particular, okay? If those continue, then what sorts of futures do we wind up living? What sorts of worlds do we find ourselves in? Well, you've seen them all over the place. We have worlds like Minority Report. We have worlds like Blade Runner. We have worlds like Idiocracy, if you want to take that as an example. We have Jurassic Park and a whole slew of movies which are about the very near future, or almost now, something that might actually be happening in a bunker somewhere under the Pentagon. But they are all basically predicated on seeing what unites this whole set of narratives under continue is that they represent the extrapolation of existing identifiable trends. The second chunk of possibility space to look at is called collapse. And where do you find collapse stories? Where do you find those scenarios? Well, they're not difficult to locate either. We're hearing more and more about them these days. You can look at a film like Mad Max, pictured there on the screen, or the upcoming film The Road, The Day After Tomorrow, Children of Men. There are books like Robert Kaplan's The Coming Anarchy, like Jim Kunstler's Long Emergency, like Jared Diamond's book, Collapse. It's right there in the name, not difficult to spot. Like any number of movies with Kevin Costner in them, disaster movies, in more than one sense. And these are examples, you could say, instantiations of a particular type of story which has to do with something about the social fabric or economic fabric or both coming apart, collapse stories. Okay, and then the third is what we call discipline. Now, for those who see that continue is not possible and collapse is not preferable, then we have discipline stories. And where do we hear about, where can we find those? Well, it's not difficult to locate those either once you start looking for them. There are films like Gattaca, which is the one in the picture there. Well, let me just say, first of all, what unites this set of scenarios is that they are all about the more or less universal adoption or imposition of a set of values. So they are about the disciplining of a group of people, of a society, whether sort of consensually or at the behest of a small group, to follow a particular path. So you can see that in Gattaca, sort of about very narrowly defined life paths based on your genetic heritage. You can see it in films like 1984 and books, Handmaid's Tale, Ecotopia. And in case you're getting the idea that these are all negative scenarios, that this is just another word for dystopia, it also includes all of the prescriptions of the ecologically minded. Now, Stuart Brand's new book, Whole Earth Discipline, it's right there in the title too. Also an example of this third corner of possibility space. And finally, we have transform. So continue, collapse, discipline, and transform is the fourth corner. And where can you find examples of transformation, of societies which have in some meaningful way and some profound way transformed from what they were before? Well, we usually think of these in terms of two subcategories or two types, two species. One of them is more technological orientation. And if any of you know the work of Ray Kurzweil, the idea of the singularity, which, you know, a mathematical concept of a curve which approaches infinite change, when that's applied to history, what it means is that history is moving sort of at infinitely fast, and what is on the other side of that singularity is anyone's guess. It is completely unforeseeable and unknowable. So the idea of a singularity, which is brought about by technological change, by the merger of human intelligence and machine intelligence, that's an example of transformation. This picture comes from The Matrix, as many of you would probably recognize. So that's another example. Accelerando by Charlie Stross. And then the second sort of subset of transformation has a more spiritual flavor. So the idea of a second coming, or of a time change, the 2012 phenomenon also, I think, would qualify as a transformation moment. Now, what I've just described to you is a set of 4 alternative futures. 4 kind of generic images of the future that exist in our society and in others, and that can be understood as a way to kind of map the futurescape as a whole. Now, these 4 generic images of the future, or GIFs, this method comes from Jim Data, who runs he's the director of the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies, where I work, and he's probably the most experienced futures educator on the planet. And the way he came to these categories was by listening to people talk about futures. I mean, it's empirically derived from what is actually out there. Now, there may be other and better ways of dividing up possibility space, but I haven't found them. If there are other ways that are equally sort of insightful and helpful, then please let me know. Because as far as I'm aware, this is the only method that provides a lens for looking at, classifying, and talking about a vocabulary, a lexicon, a set of labels that let you talk about the variety of images of the future that we have inside our heads and in our media. And so what this maps overall is another way of dividing up that cone, the cone of possibilities that we talked about earlier, the 4 corners of possibility space. So there ends the kind of the theoretical interlude. Now, what I want to do with the bulk of the next part of my presentation is show you a series of projects that I've been involved with, which attempt to take this very abstract and probably quite theoretical, and I hope not too boring sort of framework that I've just laid out for you, and turn them into concrete experiences that make sense to people viscerally as well as intellectually. And this story, when I say we in the following set of projects, when I say we, I almost always mean myself and Jake Dunnigan, who is my work partner on these projects and who works at the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, but he was in Hawaii for the several years that we were working on these things. And sometimes I mean the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies, but unless otherwise noted, it's Jake and myself and the various sort of rotating cast of collaborators that we work with on these projects. So to begin sort of going through some of those projects, these examples of mapping possibility space, I really have to begin with the project Hawaii 2050, which is was an initiative of the Hawaii State Legislature. Basically they came to us at the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies in 2005 and said, look, I'm paraphrasing, look, we're thinking about maybe Hawaii is not sustainable and we'd like it to be. So we want to have a statewide conversation about how we can make that happen. Now, when I first moved to Hawaii, it was actually in that year, in 2005, I was really quite shocked to find that sustainability thinking, that green habits and thoughts had penetrated people's thinking and behavior. Not at all. I mean, there was no real recycling program to speak of. There was no sense that this was the most isolated large community in the world. I mean, 2,500 miles from the nearest continental landmass with, I've heard different figures, but between 4 and 11 days worth of buffer in resources if shipments were to stop coming in. I saw nothing in the behavior or the thinking of the people that indicated that they were aware of the vulnerability that they were subject to. So for the state to begin to initiate a process of this kind was a real sort of opportunity. You know, it was a real sort of recognition that something needed to be done. And it's not just in Hawaii, but you know, that's the story I'm telling tonight. And so the challenge that we had was, well, they wanted to get the whole state talking about the year 2050. So how do you do that? Well, the obvious thing to do is to have a big talk shop and have someone at the front talking about, you know, how they've approached sustainability somewhere else, and do a sort of cheerleading thing about, you know, we can do this, and so on and so forth. All of which is important, you know. I don't mean to disparage it. All of which is well-intentioned and needed, and probably inevitable in a process like this. But as far as actually putting people into 2050, how the hell do you do that? And frankly, you know, we weren't really sure. The usual ways that we would, and that most futures consultancies would go about convening a scenario conversation would be you produce the scenarios and then you give them to the client or read them or find some way to sort of get them into their head and then talk about them. What we decided to do was that there would be a more interesting and potentially powerful way of getting the scenarios into their heads and into their bodies by turning them into turning those 4 scenarios, the 4 gifts, generic images of the future that we talked about, into scenarios for Hawaii in the year 2050. So how to engage up to 600 people in considering possible worlds half a century from now. Put them in the future. Where the first room which we created was, and so we had 500, 600 people, split them up into 4 different rooms. And in the first room, they were watching a debate between 2 candidates for governor in the year 2050. The incumbent was called Aloha Nuclear and Water, and through the stump speech that the representative gave, you got a sense of what kinds of problems had been resolved and what new ones had cropped up in Hawaii in the half century, you know, between when the scenario was being staged and when it was unfolding in world. And then the other candidate was called Kobayashi Virtual Concern. And so they were kind of a cross between, say, Sony and Second Life. And the conceit of the scenario was that they had about 1 billion people spending all or part of their time inside these virtual worlds. And with experience governing that kind of population base in a virtual space, they wanted to integrate horizontally into the real world, and they were going to use Hawaii as a way of doing that. So in a world where corporations can run for office, these were the 2 candidates in Hawaii. Continued growth scenario, that's how we got it across. The collapse scenario was as different as we could make it from continuation. In it, the people who entered the room were cast in the role of refugees of climate change. So they were fleeing sort of low-lying Pacific atolls that were, disappearing under rising sea levels. And the stern-looking guy at the front of the room there was, I was going to say inducting them into as citizens of the so-called Democratic Kingdom of Hawaii. And just so that I'm not, talking about all of this and not showing you it all, I'm going to give you a quick video. These were half-hour experiences, give or take, and they were not originally intended for video. So the couple minutes clip that you're about to see might just give you a little bit of a sense of what it was like for the people in the room, because of course being in the room was the point of the scenario. So.
Aloha! Good. Sounds Hawaiian already. Welcome again to the Democratic Kingdom of Hawaii. As His Majesty's Royal Delegate, I am privileged to induct all of you into our island nation. As you walk in, you were given this, a citizenship card. This will be your principal identification document. Here you will have the opportunity to accumulate privileges through the ranks. Because here in the Hawaiian Kingdom, we want you to achieve all your goals and aspirations. Please, all of you may stand up now. Raise your right hand as shown. Repeat after me. I solemnly declare my unconditional obedience.
I solemnly declare my unconditional obedience
to the Democratic Kingdom of Hawaii.
to the Democratic Kingdom of Hawaii
And its values of pono, aloha, loyalty, and security.
and its values of honor, aloha, loyalty, and security.
I trust the legitimacy and wisdom of the Hawaiian King,
I trust the legitimacy and the wisdom of the Hawaiian King,
of his elders, his patrons, and his officers.
of his elders, his patrons, and officers.
Okay, so that was an example, a short clip from a half-hour experience of a collapsed version of Hawaii in the year 2050. The third scenario, again following the framework that I've outlined for you, discipline, was as different again as we could make it. In it, people entered a space which was signposted the Honolulu Ahupua'a Civic Education Center. Now, an Ahupua'a was traditionally in Hawaiian, prior to European arrival, was the traditional unit of governance, which also coincided with the boundaries of the watershed, right? So before Europeans came to Hawaii, one of the levels of governance was based on nature's own boundaries. So the idea is that in this disciplined version of Hawaii, which has sort of returned to that way of doing things, the people in the room were basically cast as something like jury duty, where it's a sort of civic duty that you have to undertake. In this green version of Hawaii, you have to attend compulsory education centers. So the Civic Education Center gave them a rundown on creating your own clothes from hemp, and also generating biofuel from algae. So these are both kind of technologies that exist now or that are a little bit sort of over the horizon. The idea was not that it was a back to the future, that this was an entirely retrogressive, past-looking future, but that it was an illustration of one of the ways of playing out the prescriptions of the ecologically minded. And the fourth room was Transform. And in Transform, we had these fellows from MBED, the Mind Body Enhancement Depot, Pacific Islands branch, who came out and addressed the room full of people who were, it turns out, pre-mods, that is, non-modified human beings in a post-human world. And so the pre-mods were being, the conceit here was that the World Council had been monitoring the Global Happiness Index, and pre-mods were dragging it down. So they were being given a set of subsidized or free modifications, sort of mental or bodily or both, chlorophyll therapy so that they wouldn't have to eat so much. They could just photosynthesize directly like plants, teleport implantations, telepathy implantations, those sorts of things, good staples of science fiction, but the general idea being that this corner of possibility space would be instantiated in a specific way that people in 2006, in August 2006, when this took place, could experience for a while. So these four experiential futures were the answer to that question that we set out to ask: how do we put 600 people into 2050 so that they can meaningfully spend some time there? Now you will have seen from the photographs and so on. This was not Hollywood level production values. The budget for this was not enormous, and we weren't working with sort of Walt Disney levels of resources, but what we found was that it worked. It worked like gangbusters, and so this is from a survey that the Hawaii Institute of Public Affairs ran at the end of that event, at the end of the day, and this segment, it was a full-day event, the kickoff to Hawaii 2050, the initiative I mentioned. It was a full-day event, and the experiential futures component lasted an hour and a half, and this was the single sort of best received piece of the puzzle by people there. And so the question posed was, the opportunity to experience alternative futures was thought-provoking and motivates me to action. 61% said strongly agree, 34% said somewhat agree, and somehow that adds up to 101%. But so 6% either strongly or mildly disagree. But the point is that, based on their own feedback, what we did worked. And quite apart from that, when you work as a consultant, when you run workshops, you get a sense of what the energy is like in a room. And, anecdotally, and what it was like from our point of view, people were energized by this. It's not that they, who knows whether you can speculate as to whether suspension of disbelief was effected for long enough that they felt like they were there. I seriously doubt it. But the point is that they were given another way of thinking about what 2050 would be like. In fact, 4 other ways of thinking. People actually experienced only 2 out of the 4 because of limited time, but they had an opportunity to hear about the other 2, in lunch breaks and so on. And the point of it is to pluralize the images of the future which they're able to entertain in concrete terms. That's the point, and from that point of view it seemed to work, which inspired us to continue to experiment in this vein. Now, also from Hawaii 2050, you can't see it from the shots I've shown you so far, but we created, together with our graphic design collaborators, a huge number of artifacts, of objects to dress the rooms with, and to sort of help bring the stories to life. So this is advertisement for tourism on Mars, and the Embed Chimera series, the thing I was telling you about a moment ago. Advertisement for the kind of oxygen being pumped into the room. We had audio environments for each of the 4 to sort of help subtly put people into the space we had in mind for them. And so each of these things, basically, with a whole slew of designs and little take-home individualized objects. Is the citizenship card that you heard about, the 2050 Governor of Hawaii Kobayashi Virtual Concern election poster. These are inhale cigarettes, scrubs lungs with anti-cancer nano clouds. We had a lot of fun with these, just because we were basically just seeing how many things we could create in the lead up to the event. Memory gum, chew once to store, chew again to remember. The Ahoy bar, made with real Martian chocolate, helps kids grow during long space trips. These are silly. They are frivolous, contrary to what Nathan so kindly said at the start of my talk. But they have a serious idea behind them. If you can't read that one, it's down the bottom. Up the top there it says, change your chemical gender. The product is called transgendrin. And the slogan is the last word in sex play. So these were collectively what we already, when we were doing Hawaii 2050, what we were calling found futures. And so Jake Dunnigan and I decided that this would be, even before the event, that this would probably be something we'd want to continue to explore, and so Found Futures became the name for it. And it led sort of indirectly to the next project which we undertook, which was postcards from the future. Now the reason for the postcards was, the motivating question was, how do we help people who make their living from tourism prepare for the possibility that business as usual may fail them? Okay, so here's the setup. We did a workshop with the Travel Industry Management School at the University of Hawaii, and it was for a group of representatives of the travel industry in Hawaii, which, as you may know or can imagine, is the largest civilian industry in the islands. It's very, very big and important to people's livelihood. So hotel owners, restaurant proprietors, people who run cruise liners. These are the sorts of people who rely on things being the way they are, and who would, understandably, be very threatened by things changing in the dramatic ways that I've been sort of gesturing to so far in this talk. So how do we help them, on a budget and with limited time? How do we help them think their way into those alternative possibilities? So we decided, well, it's travel, so let's make them postcards, and we'll give them the postcards in the workshop, and they can think about the future on that basis and have a sort of have something tangible to hang their thinking on. So this first postcard on the left there, it's actually in Hawaiian. It says, Ko Hawaii pai aina e komo mai, welcome to the Hawaiian Islands. And on the right, this is the reverse of the card, it says, Dear so-and-so, aloha and congratulations. You have received an invitation, non-diplomatic, to visit the Commonwealth of Hawaii. If you would like to visit, please sign and return this slip by the 31st of June 2030 and indicate your willingness and readiness to prepare to undertake physical work while you're in the islands. Okay, so the idea was that we were not just taking postcards and saying, hey, I'm in this version of the future, hey, I'm in that version of the future. We were taking the iconic paraphernalia of tourism and inflecting it through different scenaric lenses. So the second one was actually, this is the closest thing to a conventional postcard in the four. Maui Hatton, the picture there, which you can't quite read the legend for, says, the Two Seasons Underwater Hotel and Casino. And the top left says the East-West Maui Hatton Bridge. So the idea here is that it's continued growth. The last one was discipline, as you can see. And on the back there, again, it's not legible on the screen, but it contains an RFID tag and international postage is prepaid, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a high-tech tourism postcard, but from a future in which the trends which have driven Hawaii to be the mecca that it is for people who don't want to do anything, those continue until for another 30 years. Now, the fourth postcard, Aloha from Blue Hawaii. This looks like 1960s, but if you kind of pay careful attention, there's a little registered trademark sign in the top right corner, and there's a guy wearing what looks like a weird headset, amid all the other Hawaiian cliches that you can possibly imagine. Hula girls, guys playing the ukulele, surfing. I mean, it's really got everything. On the back, it says, Dear Mom, having a groovy time here in the newest state in the Union. Nothing but pure, unblemished views, palm trees, pretty girls, and sweet waves. Surfing all day and beach parties with Elvis, trademark, and friends every night. Blue Hawaii, registered trademark, is the best. Love, Junior. Okay, so I said it was riddled with cliches, and I wasn't kidding. It really is. But down the bottom here in the fine print, have you ever wished you could visit 1960s Hawaii? Now you can. For over 10 years, Kobayashi Virtual Concern has led the way in immersive worlds. We call it being there. Thousands have benefited from our entirely realistic, proprietary digital recreations of the most exciting times and places ever. Ancient Rome, revolutionary France, the Wild West, Mars colony, and many more. You can rent Being There headsets at 230 locations across the world. Actual appearance may differ from products shown. Begin your adventure today. So this is a transformation future. Transformation is quite a difficult future to convey, but what we thought we'd, in the form of a postcard, which turns out to be a cover for an advertisement for, the Hawaii that never was, but that I'm sure a lot of people would like to visit. And the fourth and final in this set, Hawaii needs your aloha. Please save our islands. You might recognize the iconic diamond head in the background there with a sort of shantytown in the front. And on the back, it says, to the Secretary General of the United Nations, every day since the devastation of Hurricane Cyrus, the 500,000 people who remained on the islands of Hawaii have faced the threat of starvation and disease. The beleaguered United States government, unable to offer aid, officially withdrew 2 years ago. This once beautiful Pacific paradise has since given way to mob rule and guerrilla warfare, and then we call on you to do the following, etc., etc. So this is Hawaii as basket case, Hawaii as Haiti. And it's sent to the UN Secretariat in Tiananmen Square, Democratic Republic of China. So cramming in as much scenaric detail as we can that unfolds the more you look at it. And so those four futures we presented to people in a workshop setting, but they're postcards. And we realized not long after the event that these were just begging to be sent out into the world. So if you love your artifacts from the future, set them free. What we did was we got the names and addresses, home addresses where we could get them, for the most prominent community leaders in Hawaii, 125 of them, because that's all we could afford. And and sent these to them one at a time so that they would arrive, in the morning mail, one day at a time without any explanation. So there'd be these sort of missives from the future, prodding and really, urging people to think about the various futures that Hawaii could be undergoing about 30 years from now. And that process, it is difficult to gather data about exactly what happens when you send things out into the wild. Futures in the wild is what we call it. When you send it into the wild, you have no idea actually how people respond, but you do hear anecdotes sort of float back from time to time when people find out who did it or whatever. And one that was sort of most, I think, pleasing and a real vindication of the decision to try to do this was from a journalist who wrote this up in the Advertiser the week after the campaign. And she had spoken to a lady who worked for she was the personal assistant to the CEO of a gas company, that is a gas station franchise in the islands. And that lady had said when she received the Day 4 postcard, the Hawaii Needs Your Aloha card, that it made her realize that Hawaii was dodging a bullet every hurricane season. Now, that's just a small thing, but it was a real sort of vindication for us that when you send these things out there incrementally and one at a time and, in a scattershot way, you do urge people to think about how the future could be different and challenging in this case. So the next project that we undertook built on these previous two, Hawaii 2050, which was, in a closed sort of workshop environment, the postcards from the future, which culminated in sending the artifacts out into the world, and Found Futures sort of really got on its legs with this next project, which is called Found Futures Chinatown. We got a grant to do an art project in the Chinatown district of Honolulu, and the question which this raised for us was, can we challenge a community to consider alternative futures in the midst of everyday life? And we wanted to actually build out a series of scenarios, create the logic for them and sort of tell the story, and then translate that story into a series of props, into a series of artifacts from the future for each scenario, and then distribute those throughout the environment in Chinatown for people to sort of stumble across in the course of their everyday lives. So the first one was what we internally, these names were just what we called the project to ourselves, because there was no single location where you could go to see all this stuff, at least to begin with. And so we called this scenario McChinatown. And the idea is that in this version of Chinatown, another thing I should say, that what's different about this project from the others is that each scenario is on a different timeline from the others. So whereas the other projects I've described, there are 4 versions of 2037 or 4 versions of 2050, a cross section of that cone of possibilities we talked about. These scenarios are set at different points in the future. So just to be aware of that. So McChinatown was based on the idea that Chinatown, which actually is my favorite district on the island of Oahu, or it's certainly the most interesting part of the city at any rate, Chinatown is taken over by national chains. There's a shadowy development company, which we called Aloha Land and Water, a precursor to Aloha Nuclear and Water, which would go on to challenge the governorship a few decades later. And this shadowy company basically bought up all the vacant lots in Chinatown, and on one First Friday is an art walk, so it's the most sort of patronized, busiest foot traffic day of the month in Chinatown. And on one First Friday, they just took over, basically. So this prominent corner property had Starbucks coming soon, massive posters for that. This one had TGI Fridays, which was selected because a TGI Fridays a couple of miles away had recently closed, and so we thought it would be plausible that it might be reopening in a different location. This, one of the most iconic buildings in Chinatown, the Mendonca building, the upper floor has been vacant for a number of years, and all of a sudden a big banner appeared saying luxury lofts starting at $2.1 million. Bidders lottery November 13th, which I think was about a month away at that point. And that's the same building at night. And to dramatize the other side of this scenario, because there's always at least 2 sides to a story, we had a Save Chinatown rally held outside the Starbucks. So fight corporate developers, join our community action this first Friday on Nu'uanu Avenue. And we had a bunch of protesters come and give out literature for savechinatown.org. There were also websites backing up the two kind of main protagonists in this story. So that was McChinatown, and we'll move along because these take a little while to describe. I apologize if this seems kind of parochial in any way. I mean, the thing is that we were trying to speak to a local audience and speak to concerns which are really, confined to that district or at best to the islands. So if these sort of seem a little bit hokey, trivial in some way, that'll be because they don't necessarily travel well. But the point I'm making with this, as with everything that I'm saying tonight, is it's at the level of methodology. It's at the level of the approach that we take, which is really sort of similar or the same, regardless of the specifics of the location. You have to make it specific in order for it to be meaningful to anyone. But yeah, they don't always travel well, so that's why it requires a little bit of background. So Green Dragon was based on the notion that in 20 years' time, China has its act together in this future. In 20 years' time, China has its act together ecologically, and the US still does not. So there's an organization called Sovereign Green, which is beginning to emerge in Hawaii and serve as a rallying point for those who want Hawaii to be independent or reassert its sovereignty or whatever. But it's based not around claim to any particular heritage or anything like that, but just to commitment to Hawaii's ecological well-being. So, and actually that's a political force that has not yet really started to be manifested in Hawaii, although, according to this scenario at least, it could be. So Sovereign Green is the backdrop to that, and Sovereign Green is looking to China, to this green China as a kind of possible patron or sponsor of a Hawaiian withdrawal from the closeness of its relationship to the United States, which is very close, as you know if you've been looking at Google Street View over the last few days. So this is an example. This is a Hawaiian flag, but with the British Union Jack swapped out of the top left corner and replaced with a green Chinese flag as a little sort of clue scattered around Chinatown that a green China and Hawaii might sort of eventually converge politically sometime in the future. Now this figure is an artist's impression of a gift from the Chinese government to the people of Hawaii in 2026. And it's called the Statue of Harmony. So a little bit like the Statue of Liberty, which was a gift from the French to the US. The Statue of Harmony here, like I said, background is necessary, but in Hawaii this makes sort of instant sense to a lot of people. On the left there is Sun Yat-sen, the Chinese revolutionary. On the right is Queen Liliuokalani, who was the last Hawaiian monarch deposed in 1893 when the US stepped up its involvement. So this is a kind of and we've got a little dirigible in the background there to give you a sense it's in the future at a glance. And this is Honolulu Harbor, as you can see, Aloha Tower in the background. The Statue of Harmony is a symbol of the increasing closeness of ties between China and Hawaii, and we put it out in Chinatown for people to look at with bilingual notices indicating that this would be appearing in, or could be appearing in 2026. It also appeared on magnets, which we drop-lifted in various souvenir stores, as you can see in this picture. And the third, and in this case, for reasons we don't have time to go into, final installation in the Found Futures Chinatown series was called The Birdcage, and it was based on a bird flu outbreak, which took place 10 years from now, or 10 years from then, which was spring 2006. And so this story, again, like the others, this had a few more moving parts, really. What you can see there on the left in this alleyway is a wall of missing posters of the kind that you see when, there's a real civil disturbance or something that shakes people up. People go missing. Perhaps they've been quarantined. Perhaps they've been claimed by the flu. It's hard to say. There's a detail of the same thing. And signage indicating the authorities' response. In case of secondary outbreak, these are the places on the island where you can go to be quarantined, and these are the routes out of Chinatown, which is being shut down. Now, this was not chosen at random. This premise for a scenario was not chosen at random. It was based, actually all of them were based on conversations that we'd had with residents and and business proprietors in the area, and responding to concerns which they had, or which were sort of dormant, but not necessarily being talked about in the usual channels at that time. So this is based on the historical connection in Chinatown, which was struck by the plague in 1886 and again in 1899, and large parts of it were burned down on both occasions. Which, it's a long time ago by the standards of a lifetime, but there is certainly a folk memory of the authorities' response and suspicions about the fact that they may have been targeting the Chinese population in running out the virus. So that's the reason for the birdcage scenario. But we had these artifacts which told various pieces of the story: all clear, area safe for habitation. And here's an ambulance-chasing lawyer saying, you may be entitled to a settlement for forced quarantine or property lost due to incineration. Trying to sort of, the technique here is, to think about all of the various spin-offs, all of the little pieces of evidence that spin off and are left behind, the traces of historical events. They're all around us now for actual history, but when it comes to futures artifacts, this is a fairly productive way to think about what kinds of things would it leave behind, and then how can we create those and leave them behind. Poster for Maui indicating Maui has not been struck by the bird flu, so over here it's sunblock, over there on Oahu it's gas masks. And this was this shot is of the kind of pièce de résistance of the whole thing, a bronze plaque which we installed on a corner of Chinatown, commemorating the bravery of the people and the sacrifice of those who fell to the flu. Close up on it. In the memory of those who suffered and perished during the weeping spring of 2016, our community has grown stronger in the wake of your sacrifice. So as to that question, which I said we came into this project with, can we challenge a community to consider its alternative futures in the midst of everyday life? The answer is yes, we can. But you have to be careful. And the reason you have to be careful is when you're dealing with everyday life, people can very readily misunderstand things. And in particular, for the Chinatown scenario I described, that got a lot of mixed attention because people thought it was actually happening until they sort of looked into it and realized it wasn't. So that ended up on the front page of the Honolulu Advertiser. But we learned from that experience. There's the school of thought that says there's no such thing as bad publicity, but there is also the school of thought that says you want people to be, discussing the actual contents of the scenario, not just sort of getting all indignant because they don't like the way that you brought it to their attention. So it's something to be aware of. Okay, next project. It's going to start to move a lot faster because I've talked about multi-scenario ones and made a lot of methodological sort of side notes. These are just to give you a sense. These will be shorter to just give you a sense of the variety of other experiential futures that we have dipped a toe into. So for South by Southwest 2008. The question here was, how can we convey a scenario set in the year 2025 about lockdown of intellectual property to a room full of people? So in brief, this story, well, have you folks seen Boogie Nights? Okay, so maybe you have, maybe you haven't. So it's an excellent film actually by Paul Thomas Anderson, and it stars Mark Wahlberg as porn star Dirk Diggler. So what we did with this story was we picked up the Dirk Diggler story where the movie leaves off in the mid-'80s and told the rest of his life story through to the year 2025 when the scenario was set. So it was as a tribute to his life. So these flyers we produced and distributed around the event so people would know to come and pay their respects to Dirk Diggler. And then a priest said a few words in honor of him. The Dirk Diggler was a porn star. Okay. This is a little difficult because we're talking about trans reality scenarios here. So we were working within the context of a fictional story and treating it as real, and running it forward past what you actually saw in the movie. But the general idea is that in the late 80s, or at the end of the movie, Diggler he's fallen on hard times. or soft times. He's impotent. He's an alcoholic. He's struggling with substances. And so at the end of the 80s, he sells the rights to his famous 13-inch member to a company making marital aids. Right? They buy it from him, and he signs a contract to say that they can make a likeness of the famous Digler appendage. And years later, this comes back to haunt him because his career has a comeback with when Viagra becomes available, and then in the 20-teens, he launches teledildonics comes of age, right? Virtual sex, and so he launches a product which makes the virtual experience of sex with Dirk Diggler available. But it turns out that through a series of mergers and acquisitions, the Disney company now owns the rights to his penis. So he has literally lost the copyright in his manhood, and he takes it all the way to the Supreme Court. This is an aging Dirk Diggler fighting that battle. You know, he attracts the support of many well-meaning people who want to see his rightful property restored to him. But he dies in 2025, having lost the case, and he's defeated but unbowed. And so in this version of Dirk Diggler's life, we see an icon of copy fight movement, of resistance to corporate lockdown on intellectual property. So that was the story. The way that we conveyed it was through a memorial service, which people could attend, to pay respects. We had a full house. It was extremely weird, and a mixed success, but worth trying. So the answer to the question, how do we have people think about the scenario in 2025? You put the audience inside it, and that's what we tried to do with the Hawaii 2050 project. Also, is put the audience inside the scenario, cast them in a role so that they're implicated, so that they're not just watching it kind of with the imaginary fourth wall, so that they are mourners at the eulogy for Dirk Diggler, or so that they are refugees being inducted into the Democratic Kingdom of Hawaii. That's the general technique. Future Jamming 101. This is a project that I undertook with Scott Groniger of the Department of Art at the University of Hawaii. And the question that motivated this one was, can the techniques of experiential futures be taught to a classroom full of political science students? And well, to be fair, it was actually a classroom of political science students and another classroom of beginning digital imaging students, his students, and we had a joint sitting for 5 weeks and did this project wherein the students selected 2 domains, 2 subject matter areas, and we divided it into 4 so that everybody would be in a group doing continue, collapse, discipline, or transform of media or energy. So to give you a very brief example, this is the energy group. Top left there is continue, and then it's collapse, discipline, transform, going clockwise. So they all produced multiple artifacts, and they all installed those artifacts out in the world once they were done, and evaluated their effect, if any, on people's potential awareness of these stories that they were trying to convey. So this is a French movie poster for a documentary set in that was made in 2038 called Une friche au paradis, which is. I had nothing to do with this, by the way. I mean, they chose the topics. That they figured out what the artifacts were going to be, and they decided where to put them, with a little bit of advice. But it was basically, their own project. So this means a wasteland in paradise, and it's about a continuation of energy towards a nuclear future. Bottom left is a super ferry, which is a very political issue in Hawaii at the time, referencing that. And so the other group, the media scenarios. Again, same pattern, continue, collapse, discipline, transform. And the example here, continuation of media, these students came up with a product called I Dream, which is genre-driven dreams that basically you can swallow when you go to bed at night and have the kinds of dreams that you want to have. And they, as you can see, placed these around the campus for people to stumble across. So energy and media, they chose those topic areas and did a really great job with it. So the answer to the question is yes, you can get a room full of people who have never done this before to do this, and it's can be extremely potent as a learning experience. The next project, CCA Wattis exhibit. Those words should resonate a little bit. A master's student in the curatorial program, Sally Swed, approached us early in 2008 with the intention of turning a scenario that she had found, you know, the Americana exhibition just out here in the Wattis Institute Gallery. So the question that we sort of, I mean, these questions, by the way, are all retrospectively imposed, and it's much fuzzier as you go along, but how to create an experiential future in a gallery setting. Basically, we wanted to convey a story about a Hawaii that, that was closed to the outside world for most of the 21st century. So the whole exhibit, this one was set in the year 2108, 100 years after the actual year when it was set, when it was happening. We'll skip a couple of pictures there. So this is a laser-etched ration card for the Ahupua'a of Honolulu. You'll see some of the same ideas coming up again, but exploring them from a different angle. This is a mobile phone that's been, retrofitted with a hand crank and a solar panel, because, if a currently technology-rich population were to close itself off, you can be sure that they would repurpose a lot of existing artifacts in interesting ways. And similarly with this wok made out of a car hubcap. So the answer to that question is set the gallery itself in the future. And as always, the attempt is to kind of try to construct the audience, or invite them to be constructed as being in the future and thinking about what that might feel like to be there. Okay, we're down to the last two, and very briefly, the question that motivated this one was, how can we collectively meet the future's toughest challenges? And this project was of Institute for the Future, not a project of HRCFS or Found Futures, although I was involved as game master of Superstruct. And the Institute for the Future billed it as the world's first massively multiplayer forecasting game. And it was run by Kathy Vian for the 10-year forecast program, and Jane McGonigal, alternate reality game designer, was in charge of the game design, and Jamae Casher was in charge of the scenarios. So, and I'm saying all of that because, credit where credit's due, but also the perspective that I have on this is as a curator of content, not as the mastermind of the scenarios. So in Superstruct, 7,000 people played their way through a crisis in the year 2019, during which it's forecast by a supercomputer called the Global Extinction Awareness System that humanity has 23 years left on the clock because of a cocktail of deadly super threats. So the goal of the game, and the reason for the name Superstruct, is that people could play they play themselves, they play the role of themselves in the future, and take part in discussions and tell stories about their lives then, and also propose superstructures, which are, in the parlance of the game, superstructures are organizations that piece together collaborations that haven't been seen before, unprecedented ways of having people solve humanity's major problems. And so that's what that project was about. And the answer to the question, how do you have people collectively solve or attempt to solve, address some of the future's toughest challenges? The answer is pretend it's a game. And that was one of the reasons, one of the inputs into the final project I want to outline for you briefly, called Coral Cross. Now, Coral Cross was a project of the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies, and it was commissioned by the State Department of Health in 2008, with the CDC in Atlanta paying for it. Now, it was an experiment for them and something they'd never tried before, but what they wanted to do was have us get people to think about what it would be like to live through a pandemic, a severe pandemic, a deadly pandemic, on the order of 1918, or one of a seriously disruptive, socially disastrous pandemic, so that people actually have an opportunity to think about what that would be like and who should be vaccinated in that kind of event. So that was in 2008. Now that was commissioned last year. Now it was originally set in 2012. Because we had not run the project yet. It was commissioned and we were working on it. And it was set in 2012 because we had this challenge of how do we put people into the mindset of a health disaster unfolding around them, but without freaking them out unduly. And so the solution that was adopted to begin with was to hypothesize an organization set in Hawaii again called Coral Cross, which is a grassroots response to natural disasters, a grassroots sort of a community-driven effort to deal with major disruptions. And so this website that you can see, that's actually a comp that was mocked up prior to the launch of the game, indicating it's dated 2012, and it looks like the website of an NGO. It looks like the website of a nonprofit. It's supposed to. It's supposed to sort of put people into that scenario in the sense of, it's got all the information about, how you can buy Coral Cross paraphernalia and volunteer and do all the things that these sorts of organizations do. And it's also got information increasingly as time goes on and the scenario sort of begins to express itself about the emergence of this disaster, of a severe flu pandemic. Now, all of that, what you just saw, that stuff was produced in March and April of this year. And then, of course, now let's see if we can do this. And then, you know what happened. In late April, H1N1 swine flu hit international headlines, and this was a month before we were going to launch that project, and we couldn't in good conscience launch a project set in 2012 about a pandemic while an actual or apparent pandemic was going on. So we, within a month, retooled the entire project and made it, instead of an alternate reality game about 2012, turned it into an emergent reality game about 2009, about what is happening today, or at that time, a couple of months ago. And so this gave people the opportunity to learn about vaccination, about the risks of flu, about how it transmits, how to avoid all those sorts of things, and they would be given vigilance points for doing so and bringing other people in. So the idea of an emergent reality game trying to sort of run in parallel to actual events, to run in parallel to current events, was the sort of hastily cobbled together rescue package for this project, which was a mixed success. I mean, it's I think given the timeline, it was amazing, and given the nature of the challenges, it was a little disappointing, but still an extremely interesting and unusual, because rarely are you midway through a scenario making process when the scenario itself starts to happen and actually overtakes you. People within the game had the opportunity to become infected, and if they didn't, sort of attend to things, then they would be deceased. So that was the Coral Cross experience, the most recent in a whole string of projects. Now, I said I would spend the bulk of tonight, describing the sequence of projects in my work that's provided an insight into experiential futures. But I think it's time to draw very briefly a couple of quick lessons, discoveries out of this whole process, and then we can sort of open it up for discussion. I think one of the most important discoveries we made, and it took a while to identify in this whole sequence of learning experiences and of experiments, is that we needed to become designers, and we were in fact doing design work. We just didn't realize that that's what it was called to begin with, in a way. I mean, each of these projects is the design of an experience given certain parameters. You have a room that seats 500 people and 15 minutes, and at South by Southwest, and you have this scenario. How do you get it into people's heads? How do you put them inside it? That's the point of departure for using a really sort of non-medium specific way of thinking about conveying future scenarios. I think the second important discovery that we made, I just used the expression conveying scenarios. I think the second important discovery is that we weren't just conveying them. I mean, it started out as a communicative issue of how do we get 500 people, 600 people to think about these things and really feel them. How do we get the scenario from our heads into theirs? But it wasn't, to me, this work is not solely about propositional channeling. It's not about broadcast. And what happens is, and you'll see this in the last couple of projects that I looked at there, Superstruct and Coral Cross. These are about making futures a space of conversation, wherein the design challenge is to design the way that everyone can contribute to it, that everyone can use whatever you put out there, whatever artifact or experience you put out there, as a foil for their own thinking and feeling about the future, about the range of possible futures. But ultimately, it's about what happens for everyone, not just sort of, how do I get it from here over to there? And that was and is, I think, a pretty important discovery, not just for us, but for the futuring enterprise as a whole. Because I think the last sort of thing I want to say before wrapping up here is that futures has, for a long time, been associated with the guru, with the genius, with the crystal ball. I mean, don't even get me started on that. Okay, with the sage on the stage, really, talking about these are the things that I have seen and that you need to take account of. And this is an outdated and frankly ridiculous model for a lot of futures work. It's still, it does make sense in some limited context, but it is far, far, far from being the most important thing that this field as a whole has to offer to the world, or indeed that the world has to offer to the field. Because the point, it seems to me, is that if futures work taken as a whole is about merging the probable with the preferable, making our desired futures happen, inventing them, pursuing them, seeing them come into being. If that's what it's about, then that is not the preserve of a handful of people. That is a collective project. It's a deeply political project, and it's a collective project which requires that futurists and designers not just talk together, but work together much, much more. And that, I think, is why futures and design are getting married. I want to finish with this quote, which sort of picks up on the one that I started with. It's actually Bruce Sterling at South by Southwest, quoting Warren Ellis, the author of Transmetropolitan and other graphic novels. So he says, there's a middle distance between the complete collapse of infrastructure and some weird geek dream of electronically knowing where all your stuff is. That's the Internet of Things scenario that Bruce talks about a lot. Between apocalyptic politics and nerdvana is the human dimension. How this stuff is taken on board by smart people at the street level. And then what Sterling goes on to say is, that's where the story lies, Warren Ellis says, in this spread of possible futures and the people on the ground facing them. The story has to be about people trying to steer or condemn other people toward one future or another, using everything in their power. That's a big story. And that's the end of the quote. But and it is a big story. It's a big challenge, and it's too big for the paltry handful of people who call themselves futurists. It's actually a collective project that everyone who can do something towards ought to be doing something towards. Which is why I started here with this. This notion of the unthinkable and the unimaginable, which I think, although they're clever and helpful for demarcating the extremes of the normative spectrum, want a lot, don't want at all, there's a whole lot of space in between there, those four corners of possibility space that I've talked about tonight. All of this work, as I'd finished laying it out, I saw it kind of looked like a question mark. And I think that's appropriate because I don't know exactly what it's leading to. I don't know exactly what it culminates in. My suspicion is that it culminates in something like ambient foresight, in the development of a social capacity for foresight which is always on and always available or present inside each of our minds and each of our communities. That's a subject for another talk. But what the question mark, it turns out, also functions as a hook. And so a well-crafted scenario will not just pose a question. It will get inside the mind of and the body of the person that you are dealing with, and it will shape conversation around it. So I want to thank you very much for your attention, for bearing with me. Happy to take questions.